The year was 1960, New Orleans, Louisiana. A 6-year-old girl in a white dress and white hair ribbons stood at the front door of her home, while 4 large men in dark suits waited on the porch. Federal marshals. She did not know what federal marshals were. She did not know why they were there. She thought, because nobody had told her otherwise, that it was picture day at school. Her mother had dressed her carefully that morning, the way you dress a child for something important. White dress, white socks, black shoes, white ribbons in her hair. She looked like she was going to church. She was not going to church. She was about to walk through a mob of hundreds of screaming adults who had spent the night organizing specifically to stop her from entering a building. A building that was, illegally and constitutionally, her school. A building she had every right to enter. A building that the United States Supreme Court had ruled, 6 years earlier, she could not be kept out of. And yet there they were. Hundreds of them, with signs, with nooses made from rope, with black baby dolls arranged in tiny coffins, with a level of rage so concentrated and so sustained and so loud that the federal marshals who escorted her that morning said afterward, in interviews they gave years later, that they had never in their professional careers heard that kind of language directed at a human being. Any human being. Let alone a child, let alone a 6-year-old girl who had gotten dressed that morning thinking it was picture day. That little girl was Ruby Bridges, and what happened to her over the next 12 months was not the simple story of triumph that gets 5 minutes in the school assembly and a poster on the wall during Black History Month. It was something harder, something more complicated, something more honest about what America actually is and what it actually costs. In real time, in real bodies, in real families, to try to change it. Because Ruby Bridges did not just walk through a mob and integrate a school. She walked through a mob and then sat alone in a classroom for an entire school year while the adults responsible for that school did everything in their power to make her feel invisible and unwanted and unworthy of even the basic professional courtesies extended to a child enrolled in their building. She walked through that mob every single morning, 5 days a week, for months, while the same woman showed up daily with a black baby doll in a coffin and screamed things at a 6-year-old girl that the federal marshals declined to repeat on the record. She walked through it all while her father lost his job and her family faced eviction and her grandparents lost the lease on the land they had farmed for decades in Mississippi. All of it, all of that cascading destruction, because one little girl had walked through one door into one building in New Orleans, and then there were 3 white children who came back. And what those 3 children and their families chose to do, and what it cost them in real and immediate and devastating ways, is a story that almost nobody tells. It is a story that does not fit neatly into the triumphant version of civil rights history, the version where courage is rewarded and justice arrives on schedule. It is a story about people who did the right thing and were punished for it, who lost their livelihoods and their communities and their standing because they made a different choice than their neighbors, and who made that choice anyway. If you want to understand what integration actually meant in America, not the legal version, not the textbook version, not the version that ends at the schoolhouse door and calls it a victory, but the version that happened in real rooms, in real cities, to real families with real bills to pay and real neighbors who were watching, stay with us, because this is the part they left out. And it matters more than the part they kept in. Subscribe and turn on notifications. This is American history told the way it actually happened. Let us start further back than November 1960, because the story of Ruby Bridges does not begin on that morning. It begins in 1954, the year Ruby was born. which is also the year the Supreme Court of the United States handed down its ruling in Brown versus Board of Education. That ruling was, on paper, one of the most transformative legal decisions in American history. The court said, unanimously, that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, that the doctrine of separate but equal, which had governed race relations in American public life since the 1890s, was unconstitutional. That black children had the same right as white children to attend the same schools, with the same resources, taught by the same teachers, with the same expectation of preparation for the same futures. That was the ruling. That was the law of the land as of May 17th, 1954. And for the next 6 years, most of the American South treated that ruling the way a person treats a persistent noise coming from somewhere in the house. They knew it was there. They chose not to investigate it. They passed state laws declaring the federal ruling unconstitutional, or inapplicable, or premature. They created organizations funded by local business interests and political machinery dedicated to coordinating resistance. They made promises to their white constituents that integration would never happen on their watch, that the Southern way of life would be defended, that no federal judge could tell a Southern state how to run its schools, and they filed appeal after appeal after appeal. They created review committees. They commissioned studies. They held public hearings. They did everything that a bureaucracy can do to appear to be taking a court order seriously, while in practical fact doing nothing whatsoever to comply with it. They were running out the clock, and they were doing so with the confidence of people who believed that the clock would run out in their favor, that the political winds would shift, that the Supreme Court's patience would expire, that some procedural mechanism would eventually give them back the segregated system they had built and were determined to keep. In Louisiana, the resistance was organized at the state level with particular ferocity. The legislature passed a series of laws specifically designed to block integration, including laws that tried to prevent any state funds from going to integrated schools and laws that gave local school boards wide discretion to refuse transfers on grounds that had nothing to do with race, while having everything to do with it. Politicians competed with each other for the distinction of being the most aggressively opposed to integration. The Orleans Parish School Board, which governed New Orleans public schools, was composed of men who had no interest in integration and every interest in delay. When a federal judge named J. Skelly Wright, a New Orleans native who had been appointed to the federal bench and who took his constitutional obligations seriously in a way that made him deeply unpopular with his own community, finally issued an order that could not be appealed and could not be delayed, and required the school board to integrate its schools beginning in the fall of 1960. The board made one final strategic decision. They would test black children who applied to transfer to white schools. They would set the standards for passing so impossibly high that almost no one would qualify, and then they could stand before the federal court and say, truthfully and with clean hands, that they had opened the process, and that the black children of New Orleans had simply not met the standards required. It was a plan built on the assumption that they could design a test that no black child in New Orleans could pass. That assumption turned out to be wrong, because 6 children passed. 137 black children applied for transfer to white elementary schools in New Orleans in 1960. The testing process was opaque, and the standards were not clearly published in advance, and the people administering and grading those tests had every professional and personal incentive to find reasons to fail applicants rather than reasons to pass them. 131 of those 137 children did not pass. 6 first graders did. In the weeks between the announcement of results and the first day of school, 2 of those 6 families came under such severe economic and social pressure, and from employers and landlords and neighbors and church community members, that they withdrew their applications. They wanted to go forward. They believed in what they were doing. But the calculus of risk was simply too overwhelming. They had jobs that could be taken, homes they could be evicted from, family members whose livelihoods were dependent on the goodwill of white employers and white landowners in a city and a state that was very clear about what it would do to people who stepped too far out of line. Withdrawing was not cowardice. It was a recognition of the limits of what any family could be expected to absorb. That left 4 children. 3 were assigned to McDonough No. 19 Elementary School. 1 was assigned to William Frantz Elementary School. That one child was Ruby Bridges. Ruby had been born in Tylertown, a Mississippi in Walthall County, in a rural part of the state where the agricultural economy meant that black families worked land they did not own for white families who controlled every aspect of the economic relationship. Her parents, Abban and Lucille Bridges, were sharecroppers, which meant they farmed someone else's land in exchange for a portion of the crop, a portion that was calculated by the landowner and subject to all manner of deductions and adjustments that ensured the sharecropper remained perpetually in a position of economic dependency. It was a system designed to replicate the essential conditions of slavery without the legal mechanism of slavery. And it worked about as well as that description implies. When Ruby was 4 years old, and her parents made the decision that millions of black Southern families had been making since the Great Migration began decades earlier. They left Mississippi. They moved to New Orleans. Abban found work at a gas station. Lucille took whatever jobs she could find, sometimes working nights, to help support the family. They rented a house in a black neighborhood, and they built the ordinary infrastructure of a working-class life in a city that was better than Mississippi, but was not, by any serious measure, a place where a black family in 1960 could expect to be treated as fully equal in any practical sense. They were not organizers. They did not attend NAACP meetings or go to political organizing sessions or participate in demonstrations. They were people trying to keep their family stable, trying to give their children a safer and more abundant life than the one they had grown up in. The civil rights movement existed around them, and they supported its goals, the way most people support the goals of movements, from a position of wanting things to be better without necessarily being in a position to be the person standing at the front. The NAACP came to their door because they were looking for children who had passed the transfer test and whose families might be willing to follow through. Abban Bridges said no, Lucille Bridges said yes. These 2 answers coexisted in their household for a period, and then Lucille's won. Which tells you something about Lucille Bridges that the story sometimes fails to make explicit. She was not a woman who lacked agency in her own household or in her own life. She had thought about this carefully. She believed that her daughter walking through that door would make things better for black children who came after her. She believed that somebody had to be first. She believed that being first was worth the cost. She was right about all of it. She could not have known, at the front door talking to the NAACP representatives, the precise shape of the cost. She could not have known that Abban would lose his job within a week of Ruby's first day of school. She could not have known that her family's landlord would seek to evict them. She could not have known that her parents-in-law in Mississippi would lose access to the land they had farmed for years because the white family they leased from decided that having a granddaughter who integrated a school in New Orleans was sufficient grounds to terminate the arrangement. The cost came from directions she could not have anticipated, but she was right that it was worth it, and she was right that somebody had to go first. And she was right that the children who came after would have something different because Ruby walked through that door. November 14th, 1960. Monday morning. The federal marshals arrived at the Bridges home before school. 4 of them. Ruby was dressed and ready. Her mother rode with her. The route to the school was lined with people who had been gathering since before dawn, who had organized themselves through the networks of the white citizens' councils and word of mouth and the particular kind of social momentum that forms when a community of people who share a commitment to keeping a certain order in place recognizes that the order is about to be disrupted. The crowd screamed. It threatened. A woman near the front of the crowd held a sign that read, "We want to keep our white schools white." Another woman held the coffin with the black baby doll. Several people held nooses. Things were thrown. The language that was used was the kind of language that the marshals declined to repeat in detail when they were interviewed about that morning in the years that followed. Language of a category that strips the humanity from its target in the most complete and deliberate way possible. Ruby Bridges walked through it, head forward, steps measured. One witness who was present that morning said she moved like she was walking to church, like she had somewhere important to be, and nothing outside of her was going to interrupt her relationship with that destination. She was praying, she said later. She had been taught to pray by her grandmother, and she prayed every morning on the walk from the car to the school door. She prayed for the people screaming at her. She asked God to forgive them because they did not know what they were doing. She was 6 years old, and she was praying for a mob from the inside of a protective formation of federal marshals. There is no way to add anything to that fact that makes it more powerful than it already is. She was 6. And she was praying for the people screaming at her to forgive them. Inside the school, she and her mother were taken to the principal's office. The principal, Lloyd Ricks, was administratively present and effectively useless in every way that mattered. White families who had arrived at school that morning and encountered the mob and realized what was happening began pulling their children out almost immediately. By the early afternoon, the school was nearly empty. No one taught Ruby anything that first day. No one came to greet her or welcome her or tell her what was going to happen next. She sat in the office with her mother and waited. And eventually the day ended and the marshals took them home. At the top of the stairs, in a second-floor classroom, a teacher had been waiting all day. Barbara Henry was 30 years old. She was from Boston, Massachusetts, the daughter of a family with deep roots in that city, and she had grown up in a context that was different from New Orleans, in ways that shaped her understanding of what she was willing to do. She had been teaching at a private school in Boston. She had a position there, colleagues, a life that was comfortable and stable and that she could have continued indefinitely. When she became aware, through channels she has described in interviews over the years, that the Orleans Parish School Board was looking for a teacher willing to relocate to New Orleans and take an assignment that no local teacher would accept, she thought about it seriously, and then she said yes. She was aware of the risks. She was not naive about what New Orleans in 1960 meant for someone who was going to stand on the integration side of this dispute. Her colleagues in Boston cautioned her. Her family worried. People told her she did not understand Southern culture or Southern politics or the specific mechanisms of hostility that she would be walking into. She came anyway. She packed her belongings, and she flew to New Orleans, and she walked into William Frantz Elementary School, and she set up her classroom with the care and thoroughness of a teacher who fully intended to teach. She arranged the desks. She put up a bulletin board. She prepared lesson plans for the first week of school and the second and the third. She had books and materials and the particular readiness of a person who has decided that what they are about to do matters and therefore it deserves to be done as well as it can possibly be done. She was ready for a class of first graders. She was ready to teach whoever walked through her classroom door. On the first morning, when Ruby finally made it upstairs to the classroom, Barbara Henry greeted her the way she had decided, before Ruby arrived, that she was going to greet her. Warmly. Normally, with the complete absence of drama or pity or the particular weight that adults place on children when they need the children to understand how significant the situation is. Henry had made a decision, which was that what Ruby needed from her was not acknowledgement of the crisis. Ruby was living the crisis. She did not need her teacher to add to it. She needed her teacher to be her teacher. So that is what Barbara Henry was. She greeted Ruby as if it were an ordinary Monday morning and they were going to have an ordinary school day, and the noise outside the window was not the defining reality of what happened in this room. The classroom was empty. It was just the two of them, and it stayed that way for weeks. Barbara Henry taught Ruby Bridges every day as if Ruby were a full class. She did not scale back. She did not simplify. She prepared the complete curriculum, and she delivered it to one student with the attention and energy that a teacher brings to a full room, because she had decided that the injustice of the situation was no reason to deliver a lesser education to the one child who was present. She asked Ruby questions and listened to the answers. She read aloud and asked Ruby to read aloud back. She taught math with full explanations and full patience and full follow-through. She was, by any standard, doing excellent work in conditions that were designed to make excellent work impossible. The school itself worked steadily against her. She was not invited to faculty meetings. The exclusion was not an oversight. It was deliberate, enforced by a principal who had communicated his feelings about the integration assignment clearly through his behavior, if not his words. Henry ate lunch alone in her classroom every day. Her colleagues in the building treated her with the specific social erasure that institutional hostility produces. Not the loud hostility of the mob outside, but the quiet, consistent, daily message that she was not one of them and should not expect to be treated as one of them. Her paychecks were placed in a drawer for her to collect. The principal sent written communications rather than speaking to her. Her phone rang at night with voices that were not friendly. She stayed. Meanwhile, the Bridges family was absorbing the costs of Ruby's enrollment in real time. Abon Bridges lost his job at the gas station within a week of Ruby's first day. His employer told him that the customers were upset and there was nothing to be done about it. This was the economic structure of retaliation. Your employer did not have to say the word race, did not have to say the word school, did not have to make any explicit connection between your daughter walking through a door and you losing your livelihood. The customers were upset. There was nothing to be done. The implication was complete, without the statement. The landlord sought to evict them. The family that had rented the Bridges their home decided that continuing to do so was not something they were willing to manage. Ruby's grandparents in Mississippi were informed that their lease on the land they had farmed would not be renewed. The white family that owned the land had nothing to do with New Orleans directly. They simply knew what the name Bridges now meant in Louisiana, and they drew the appropriate conclusion about the risk of their continued association with it. The black community of New Orleans responded. This part of the story is one of the most important, and one of the least told. The people who held the Bridges family together through that year were not famous. They were neighbors and community members, and members of local churches and local businesses who understood what was happening, and understood that the family at the center of it needed to be held by something larger than themselves. People brought food to the Bridges' home when the grocery stores declined to serve them. A local black businessman hired Abon Bridges when the gas station let him go. The informal networks of solidarity that black communities in the South had developed over generations of operating in a hostile environment activated on behalf of this family, quietly, persistently, without headlines. This is the community infrastructure that civil rights history tends to bracket off in favor of the individual hero narrative. But Ruby Bridges did not survive that year alone. She survived it because dozens of people she has never been able to fully name made choices to show up on the margins of her story. Now, let us talk about the three white children. At William Frantz Elementary School in those first weeks of November 1960, Ruby Bridges was the only child in Barbara Henry's classroom. The white families had removed their children, and the school had emptied, and the few white students who remained in the building were not in Ruby's grade. Then, one by one, three families made a different decision. Pam Foreman and Lloyd Foreman, Jr. were the children of Reverend Lloyd Foreman, Sr., a Methodist minister who served a congregation in New Orleans. Reverend Foreman was not a civil rights activist. He was not a member of any organization dedicated to racial justice. He was a minister who had, through whatever process of conscience and faith and ethical reasoning his tradition made available to him, arrived at a position that he could not in good faith keep his children out of their school because a black child had been enrolled in it. He told his wife, he told his congregation, he told his children, and he took his children back to school. Yolanda Gabrielle was the third child. Her family occupied the complicated social position of Creole New Orleans, a position that was neither simply white nor simply black, in the formal categories the city used to organize itself, but that was, in the circumstances of November 1960, being asked to align itself clearly with one side of a line that the city was drawing. The Gabrielles looked at that line and decided which side they were going to stand on. The mob turned on these families with an intensity that in some ways exceeded what it had directed at Ruby herself, because Ruby was the stranger, the outsider, the person from elsewhere who had been brought in by federal power to disrupt the established order. The white families who returned to school with their children were not strangers. They were members of the community. They were neighbors. They were people who had shared holidays and church services and neighborhood events with the families who were now screaming at them. The betrayal felt personal in a way that the presence of a black child did not, because black children were expected to challenge white supremacy. White people who sided with them were committing apostasy. Reverend Foreman lost his position at his church. The congregation he had built and served voted him out. The institution through which he had expressed his vocation and his identity and his relationship with God was taken from him because he decided his children would go to school with a black child. His wife could not find work. The family's social infrastructure, the web of relationships and mutual obligations and community belonging that is the invisible wealth of a life spent in one place among one group of people, dissolved. Grocery stores declined to serve them. Neighbors stopped speaking. Other ministers in the city refused to associate professionally with Lloyd Foreman. The family became pariahs in their own neighborhood by making a choice that, in any other context, would have required no courage at all. The Gabrielle family experienced its own version of the same cascade: loss of community standing, economic pressure, social exclusion. The mechanisms of community enforcement were efficient and comprehensive, and they operated without requiring any formal coordination, simply through the common understanding shared by the people who wielded them about what behavior was acceptable and what behavior was not. These three white children and their families are not in the standard civil rights curriculum. Their names are not familiar the way Ruby Bridges's name is familiar. They are footnotes, when they appear at all, in a story whose focus is elsewhere. But they deserve to be understood as something more than footnotes. What they did was not safe and was not rewarded, and they did it anyway, and the community of people willing to do that kind of thing in 1960, New Orleans was vanishingly small. Inside the school, with those 3 children now present, Ruby was no longer entirely alone in the building. She and Barbara Henry remained the sole occupants of their particular classroom. But the presence of the Foreman children and Yolanda Gabriel, somewhere in the building, was its own kind of statement, its own quiet insistence that not everyone had decided the same way. As the school year progressed, the acute crisis outside the building gradually eased. Not because the opposition to integration had changed its position, but because sustaining that level of organized daily rage requires resources of time and energy and social coordination that cannot be maintained indefinitely. The mob thinned. The woman with the coffin doll continued to appear, but she appeared more often alone or nearly alone. White families began to trickle back, slowly and cautiously, bringing their children back to a school that was now, whatever they thought of it, integrated in the legal sense of that term. By spring, Ruby was eating in the cafeteria. She was going outside for recess. She was having occasional encounters with other children that resembled, if not friendship exactly, then at least the ordinary friction and negotiation of children sharing space. The school year was going to end. Something had survived that nobody had guaranteed would survive. And then the school year ended, and Barbara Henry was told her contract would not be renewed. The Orleans Parish School Board, when it declined to renew her contract, offered no official reason. There was nothing official to offer. She had done nothing wrong. She had, by any professional measure, done something remarkable. But she was the person who had made integration work at William Frantz, and letting her simply continue felt to the board like endorsement of something they had spent years fighting against. So they found a way to end her connection to the school without calling it punishment. And she packed her classroom and she left New Orleans and she went back to Boston. She and Ruby Bridges did not speak. For 38 years, Ruby went through school in New Orleans and graduated and built an adult life. She worked, she married, she had children. For much of her adult life, she has said in interviews, she did not present herself publicly as a civil rights figure. She had been a child during the events she was known for. The choices had been made largely by adults, by her mother, and by the NAACP, and by the federal courts, and by the marshals. Ruby had been the instrument through which the decision was carried out. That was true, and it was significant, but it was not the same as the active adult choice that the movement's more famous figures had made. She was not Rosa Parks, who had deliberately chosen her seat. She was a 6-year-old who had done what her mother told her to do. That understanding of herself began to shift in 1993 when Ruby's brother Malcolm was killed in New Orleans in a drug-related shooting. Going to his children's school to speak with teachers about supporting his kids through the grief, Ruby encountered a white teacher who, upon learning who she was, broke down completely. This teacher had grown up with the story of Ruby Bridges as a formative influence. Ruby had been, for this woman, the story she told herself about why justice was possible, why individuals mattered, why she had become a teacher. And here was Ruby, a real woman in her 30s, and the collision between the living person and the historical symbol was overwhelming. Ruby started talking. She wrote Through My Eyes in 1999. She founded her foundation. She began visiting schools across the country, including schools in Chicago, in New York, in Los Angeles, and in cities that had spent decades congratulating themselves on not being New Orleans in 1960. She stood in classrooms in those cities and looked at student bodies that were, by every practical measure, as racially segregated as the schools she had helped integrate. And she said, "This is still happening. The mechanisms are different. The results are the same. She looked for Barbara Henry. It took time to find her. Henry had returned to Boston and built a life there that was largely separate from her New Orleans story. When they finally made contact by phone, after 38 years, Henry wept. They met in New Orleans. They became and have remained close friends, the kind of friendship that forms between people who shared something that nobody else can fully understand, something that cost them both considerably, and that neither of them would undo. They wrote a book together. They speak together in schools. They returned to William Frantz Elementary School and walked through the doors together and sat in a classroom and told children the story of what had happened in that building. In 2011, President Barack Obama borrowed a Norman Rockwell painting from a museum in Massachusetts and hung it in the West Wing of the White House, outside the Oval Office. The painting, made in 1964, is called "The Problem We All Live With." It shows a small girl in a white dress, flanked by the lower halves of 4 large men in dark suits, walking past a wall on which the letters N-I-G-R are visible in large black letters, the rest of the slur cut off by the frame, and alongside a splattered tomato that someone had thrown. Obama wanted to walk past that painting every day. He invited Ruby Bridges to come and see it. When Ruby stood in the White House and looked at that painting of herself at age 6, she said she finally understood, completely and without any residue of uncertainty, what had happened to her. Looking at that image, she could see what she had not been able to fully see while she was living it. How small she was, how enormous the forces arrayed against her were, how extraordinary it was that she had walked through that without breaking, and how much of that was not her extraordinary courage, but her extraordinary innocence. She had not known enough to be as afraid as she should have been, and her not knowing had been the strategy. Her smallness and her white dress and her innocence had been the message. The adults who had put her in that position had understood something that Ruby had only understood in retrospect, that a 6-year-old walking calmly through hatred was more powerful than any legal argument, more undeniable than any court order, more humanizing than any speech. She was standing in the White House with a black president. That was also something that America had insisted was impossible for roughly the same amount of time, and with roughly the same confidence, that it had insisted a black child could not sit in a white classroom in New Orleans. The story of Ruby Bridges is a story about what it costs to move the arc of history. It is a story about a 6-year-old girl and the community of people who held her up, and the teacher who showed up every morning in an empty classroom, and the minister who lost his congregation, and the neighbors who left food on the porch, and the 38 years of silence before the phone rang, and there was Barbara Henry on the other end, crying, and the painting on the wall outside the Oval Office, and the classrooms in Chicago and New York that Ruby still visits, and the students in those classrooms who are still inheriting a system that was supposed to have been fixed 60 years ago. 96% of New Orleans public school students in 2019 were students of color. The schools that Ruby Bridges helped integrate are not integrated today, not by law, because the law changed, by practice, because the practice found new mechanisms. Housing patterns, school funding formulas, choice programs, the 10,000 daily decisions of individual families about where to live and where to send their children and who they are willing to share institutions with. The legal architecture of segregation was dismantled. The practical reality was rebuilt, slowly, through different means, in cities across the country, including and especially in the cities that had pointed at New Orleans in 1960 and said, "That is not us." Ruby Bridges is still alive. She is in her late 60s, and she still runs her foundation, and she still visits schools, and she still stands in front of rooms full of children and tells them the real version of the story, the version with the costs, the version with Barbara Henry eating lunch alone every day for a year, the version with Avon Bridges being fired the week his daughter integrated a school, the version with Reverend Foreman losing his congregation, the version with the neighbors who brought food to the Bridges family when the grocery stores would not serve them. She tells it because the simple version, the triumph version, the version that ends at the schoolhouse door with the little girl in the white dress and says, "See, it worked. See, we fixed it. See, this is who we are." That version does not prepare anyone to do the actual ongoing work. It produces pride without responsibility. It produces comfort without reckoning. It lets people in Chicago and New York and Los Angeles feel that the battle was fought somewhere else, by someone else, and was won, and that they are the inheritors of that victory, rather than the inheritors of the ongoing problem. Ruby does not let people be comfortable in that version. She is polite about it. She is warm about it. She tells the story with love and without bitterness, which is an act of generosity so large it is difficult to fully comprehend. She is forgiving in the most complete sense of that word. Not the sense that means pretending something did not happen, but the sense that means you have decided not to let what was done to you determine who you are and what you do next. She has said that the most important thing she can do now is tell the story accurately, because the story accurately told contains its own instruction. The instruction is not simply, "Be brave, face the mob." That is true, but it is incomplete. The instruction underneath that instruction is, "Be the community that holds the brave person up. Be the teacher who volunteers. Be the minister who takes his children back to school in the morning. Be the neighbor who leaves food on the porch. Be the person who makes the smaller, quieter, more ordinary choice to show up, to stay, to share the room. Be the person who does not take their children and leave when the room gets complicated." That is what the three white children represent. Not heroism in the dramatic, public-facing sense, but the ordinary choice made at personal cost to stay, to be in the room, to not make the easier choice that almost everyone else was making. The Foreman children and Yolanda Gabriel were first graders. They did not choose, and in any meaningful sense, to be there. Their parents chose for them the way Lucille Bridges had chosen for Ruby. But their parents' choice, and the cost their parents paid for it, is as much a part of the integration story as Ruby's courage on the walk from the car to the school door. History is not made only by the people in the center of the story. It is made by everyone on the margins who decided to stay. Barbara Henry and Ruby Bridges returned to William Frantz Elementary School together. They walked through the same doors they had walked through separately 60 years ago from opposite directions for different reasons at different costs. They sat in a classroom with children and they told the story. The school that Ruby had helped integrate still served a mostly black student body in a neighborhood that Hurricane Katrina had devastated in 2005, displacing tens of thousands of black New Orleanians, many of whom never came back, erasing communities that had existed for generations, rewriting the demographics of the city in ways that continued to be debated and mourned. The building was still there. The students were still there. The story was still incomplete. Two old women, one black and one white, friends across 6 decades, sat in that classroom and said, "Here is what happened here. Here is what it cost. Here is what changed, and here is what did not change. Here is what you are inheriting. Here is what we are asking you to do with it." That is the story of Miss Ruby and the 3 white children. Not a fairy tale, not a triumph with nothing underneath it. A true story about what justice costs in real lives and real bodies and real families. about who pays those costs, about the communities that hold the people paying the costs together, quietly, without recognition, for as long as it takes, about the work that continues after the victory is declared and the cameras go away and the history books turn to the next chapter. Ruby Bridges is still here. She is still telling it. The door is still open. If this story reached you, if it showed you something true about America that you did not fully see before, subscribe to this channel. We tell American history the way it actually happened, not just the triumphant parts, not just the parts that make us feel good about who we are, but the full story. The costs and the courage together, the victories and the long unfinished work that follows every victory. Leave a comment below. Tell us which part of this story hit hardest. Was it Barbara Henry eating lunch alone every day for a year and being paid by a check left in a drawer? Was it Avon Bridges losing his job the week his daughter integrated a school? Was it the Foreman family, the minister who lost his congregation for sending his children to school? Was it Ruby praying for the mob every morning on the walk from the car to the door? Was it the painting on the wall outside the Oval Office, and Ruby finally seeing herself at 6 and understanding it all? We read every comment. This community exists to have the real conversation, the one that goes past the school assembly, the one that sits with the full cost and asks what we are going to do about it. The door is open. Come on in. There is something else the standard version of this story never addresses, and it is one of the most important things about it. What did it actually feel like, from the inside, to be a 6-year-old child living through something that the adults around her could barely process? What was it like to be Ruby Bridges, not on the famous morning when the cameras were present, but on the Tuesday, and the Wednesday, and the Thursday, and the Friday, and then the following Monday, and the Monday after that, and every morning for an entire school year? What was it like to be the child who had to walk through a line that someone else had drawn, carrying a weight that someone else had placed on her, without the vocabulary or the life experience to fully understand what was being asked of her? Child psychologists became involved with Ruby's case early in that school year. Robert Coles, a Harvard-educated psychiatrist who would go on to become one of the most important researchers of childhood development in the 20th century, was working in New Orleans during that period and took an interest in what was happening to the children at the center of school integration. He began meeting with Ruby regularly, sessions that continued for years and that formed the basis for his landmark work on the psychological effects of racial stress on children. Coles later described Ruby as one of the most psychologically resilient children he had ever worked with, not because she was unaffected by what was happening to her, but because she had developed through her faith and her family and something that seemed to be constitutionally her own, a way of holding the experience at a slight distance from her core sense of herself. She prayed. She talked to God on the walk to school every morning, and that conversation gave her something to do with her attention that was not the screaming faces in the crowd. She had a relationship with a spiritual reality that was more fundamental to her than the social reality of what was happening around her, and that relationship held her in a way that the circumstances could not fully destabilize. But Coles also documented the ways the stress was present in her body and her behavior, even when she appeared outwardly calm. She sometimes stopped eating. She had moments of withdrawal at home. She talked occasionally about nightmares. She was 6. The body keeps score even when the mind is protected by prayer and family and the particular grace that sometimes visits children in impossible circumstances. Her mother was her anchor. Lucille Bridges was present at the school every day during the first weeks. She sat with Ruby in the car on the drive in. She walked with her to the door, and she was there in the afternoon to bring her home. She talked to Ruby every evening about the day. She maintained the routines of family life with fierce deliberateness because she understood intuitively and from experience that what children need in crisis is the continued presence of the ordinary. Dinner at the same time, prayers before bed, the same expectations and the same affections and the same domestic rhythms that make a home feel safe. Those rhythms are a form of love and a form of resistance, both at once. Abon Bridges was struggling. Losing his job was a material crisis, but it was also something more than a material crisis. He had been the primary earner. He had been the person whose work kept the family stable. That role had been taken from him, and the mechanism through which it had been taken, the economic retaliation of a white-controlled employer network, was one he had no direct recourse against. He could not sue. He could not organize. He could not even speak publicly about what had happened without risking further retaliation. He absorbed the loss the way that men in his position and in his era were expected to absorb such things, which is to say by carrying it without showing it. At considerable internal cost, the family held together. It held together because Lucille held it together, and because the community held them, and because the faith that Ruby expressed publicly in her prayers was also the faith that sustained the household privately in the way faith does when it is real and not ceremonial. Across the city, at McDonough No. 19, Tessie Prevost and Gail Etienne and Leona Tate were living parallel versions of the same experience. They had each other, which was different from what Ruby had. 3 children integrating a school together are still 3 children facing a mob, which is not easy, but the social reality of having companions in the experience meant something that Ruby's isolation did not allow for. The 3 girls at McDonough developed bonds that would last their entire lives. The particular closeness that forms between people who were in a foxhole together before they had the words to describe what a foxhole was. Their story is its own story, and it deserves its own full telling. There has been documentary work done on their integration experience that I encourage you to find. For this video, the point is that the New Orleans school integration of 1960 was not one story, but several, unfolding simultaneously in different buildings across a city that was trying very hard to prevent any of them from happening. Let us also talk about what was happening in the rest of the country, while New Orleans was in the middle of this crisis, because the national context matters enormously. John F. Kennedy had just been elected president in November 1960. The same month, the New Orleans school integration began. Kennedy had campaigned on civil rights themes somewhat, more than his Republican opponent Richard Nixon, but less than the movement wanted and less than the historical moment demanded. His election was understood by civil rights leaders as an opportunity, but the depth of his commitment was not yet clear. The Eisenhower administration, which had sent federal troops to Little Rock in 1957 when Governor Orval Faubus had ordered the National Guard to block integration there, had established a precedent for federal enforcement of school integration. But the political will to follow through consistently and forcefully across the South was uncertain. The Kennedy administration's early response to the New Orleans crisis was cautious. The federal government supported the marshals who escorted Ruby and the other children. It did not, in those first months, take the additional steps that the movement was asking for. Attorney General Robert Kennedy was more engaged with civil rights than many of his predecessors, but was also navigating the political calculations of an administration that needed Southern Democratic support for its broader legislative agenda. The civil rights movement was, from the perspective of the White House in 1961, one priority among many, and one with particular political costs attached to aggressive action. This is the landscape that Ruby Bridges walked into every morning. Not just the mob outside the school, but the entire political architecture of a country that was still figuring out whether it was actually going to do what its Supreme Court had told it to do 6 years earlier. The federal government was technically on Ruby's side. It was not fully on her side. It was on the side it needed to be on to avoid a constitutional crisis, which is a different thing. The children of Little Rock, the Friendship Nine, the Freedom Riders, the sit-in students at Woolworth's lunch counters in Greensboro and Nashville and across the South, the marchers in Birmingham and Selma, the children in the Children's Crusade who faced fire hoses and police dogs and mass arrest in 1963. All of them were operating in a political environment where the moral clarity of their position was not yet matched by the political will of the institutions that should have been on their side. That gap between what was morally right and what was politically convenient is the gap that individual acts of courage were asked to close. The individual acts of children, in particular, because children are harder to demonize than adults, because their vulnerability makes the opposition's violence more legible as what it actually is. America kept asking its children to close that gap. It is worth sitting with that fact. It is worth asking why the adults who created and maintained the system of segregation were not themselves required to bear the immediate personal costs of dismantling it. Why was it a 6-year-old who walked through the mob, and not the school board members who had spent 6 years defying a court order? Why was it the children of New Orleans and Little Rock and Birmingham who absorbed the physical and psychological costs of integration, while the adults who had insisted on segregation found ways to relocate their own children to private schools in unaffected suburbs and let the public school system bear the weight of a change they had refused to manage responsibly? Ruby Bridges has been asked versions of this question in interviews over the years, and she has answered it with the same clarity she brings to everything. She does not say it with anger. She says it as a factual observation. America has a history of asking its most vulnerable people to fix problems that its most powerful people created. That pattern did not start with school integration, and it did not end there. It is a pattern that runs through the entire history of American social change, and it is worth naming every time you encounter it. The cost of integration in New Orleans was not distributed evenly. The people who paid the most immediate and personal price for it were the black families who had the courage to go first. The families who lost jobs and homes and community standing. The people who paid the second most immediate price were the small number of white families like the Foremans and the Gabriels who chose to remain. The people who paid almost nothing in the immediate term were the white families who removed their children and moved to the suburbs and enrolled them in private schools and continued to benefit from public systems that their children were no longer present in. That third group did not have to pay for the integration they had opposed because they found a way to exempt themselves from it. And over the next 3 decades, as white flight reshaped the demographics of New Orleans and every other major American city, that exemption hardened into the structure of contemporary urban life. The public schools were left to the children of families without the resources to choose differently. The resources that had once imperfectly and unjustly, but still materially, served all children in a city, were redirected toward the private and parochial and suburban schools that the choosing families had chosen. By the year 2000, the Orleans Parish School Board was managing a school system that was 90% black and underfunded and struggling in every way that a school system struggles when it is trying to serve a student population that has been systematically disinvested from for decades. When Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005 and the levees failed and the lower Ninth Ward flooded and 80% of New Orleans ended up underwater, and the city's black residents were disproportionately the ones who could not get out, and disproportionately the ones who never came back. The school system that Ruby Bridges had helped integrate was among the casualties. The post-Katrina school reform in New Orleans, which converted almost the entire public school system to charter schools in the years following the storm, was celebrated in some quarters as an educational innovation and criticized in others as the final privatization of a public system that the city's political establishment had never fully committed to funding equitably. Ruby Bridges has had things to say about that, too. She has been in New Orleans since the storm. She has watched what happened to the school system. She has watched what happened to the communities. She has watched the city be reshaped in ways that continue to determine who gets to be in which rooms, which is the same fundamental question that her walk to school in 1960 was asking. She keeps asking it. She keeps visiting schools. She keeps telling the story to children who will grow up and make choices about where to live and where to send their own children and how to organize the institutions they are part of and what kind of city they are going to be. Barbara Henry, now in her 90s, is still alive. She and Ruby have maintained their friendship through the decades since their reunion. They still appear together when their health and schedules allow. They still talk regularly. They still share the particular intimacy of people who were in something together that nobody else was in, who held each other up across an empty classroom and 38 years of silence, and the entire arc of 2 lives lived in very different circumstances. The relationship between Ruby Bridges and Barbara Henry is, in some ways, the most complete answer available to the question that Ruby's story raises. The question is not just, can one brave person change the course of history? The question is, what does it look like when 2 people, a black child and a white adult, from different worlds with different stakes in the outcome, show up in the same room and treat each other as fully human, and keep showing up, and keep treating each other that way? For 60 years? It looks like 2 old women finishing each other's sentences in interviews. It looks like a friendship that was forged in the most unlikely and hostile of circumstances, and that has outlasted every single one of the people who tried to make it impossible. It looks like the most ordinary and most extraordinary thing in the world. 60 years after Ruby Bridges walked through those doors in New Orleans, the work is not done. It is not done in New Orleans. It is not done in Chicago or New York or Los Angeles or in any city in America where you can look at a school and see immediately by who is in it, what choices the community has made about who belongs where and who deserves what. It is not done in the political systems that decide how schools are funded and how neighborhoods are zoned and who has access to what opportunities. But the work has not stopped. Ruby Bridges has not stopped. The foundation she runs has not stopped. The teachers who are inspired by her story and show up every morning for their students are not stopping. The parents who make the harder choice about where to send their children, the choice that costs them social standing or community belonging or the path of least resistance, those parents are not stopping. History does not end. It accumulates. Every generation inherits what the previous ones built or failed to build, and is asked to add to it or correct it, or at minimum not to undo it. Ruby Bridges' generation built something real and paid a real price for it and handed it to the next generation, which was supposed to carry it forward. Some of them did. Some of them found ways to escape the cost and let the inheritance sit unclaimed. The inheritance is still there. The question is still open. The door is still open. That is the story of Miss Ruby and the 3 white children. It is not a story with a clean ending. It is a story about what it takes and what it costs and who keeps going. It is an American story, which means it is a story about who we say we are and who we actually choose to be. and the distance between those two things, and the people who spend their whole lives trying to close it. If this story moved you, if it gave you something you will carry forward, subscribe to this channel. Hit the bell so you do not miss what comes next. We tell American history the way it actually happened, with the full cost and the full community and the full reckoning that the simple version always leaves out. Leave us a comment. Tell us what part of this story you are going to remember. What part of it belongs to you now? The door is open. One last thing before you go. Because it matters, and it is the kind of thing that gets lost when stories become symbols. Ruby Bridges has said in multiple interviews over the years that she does not consider herself exceptional. She considers herself ordinary. She was an ordinary child from an ordinary working-class family in New Orleans who was put in an extraordinary situation by adults making decisions she had no power over. What she did was not heroic in the sense that heroism is usually meant, as a quality that belongs only to unusual people in unusual circumstances. What she did was survive and keep going, and not let the hostility of the world outside the classroom window determine what happened inside it. That capacity, she insists, is not rare. It is what ordinary people do when they have community behind them and love around them and a teacher who shows up every morning and treats them like the only student in the world. Barbara Henry has said something similar. She has said that what she did was simply teach. She was a teacher, and she had a student, and she taught her. The circumstance was extraordinary. The act was ordinary. She showed up, and she did her job, and she refused to let the institution's hostility reduce what she offered to the child in front of her. Any teacher could do that, she says. Any teacher should do that. Most of them, most days, in most schools, are doing exactly that, and nobody makes a documentary about it. The ordinariness of what Ruby and Barbara did is the point. It is the most important point. We have built a version of this story that locates the courage in a single dramatic moment. The morning walk, the white dress, the mob. That moment was real, and it was significant, and it deserves to be remembered. But the courage that actually changed something was the courage of Tuesday, and Wednesday, and Thursday, and Friday, and the following Monday, and every morning after that. The courage of showing up when it is ordinary and unglamorous and nobody is filming. The courage of eating lunch alone and staying anyway. The courage of leaving food on the porch of a family you have never met because they need it and you have it. And that is what community means. That is the courage that is available to all of us every day. In the rooms we are in, and the choices we make, and the people we decide to stay for. That is the full story of Miss Ruby and the 3 white children